Well, let me thank you all for coming this afternoon. And this afternoon's speaker has been brought to Dartmouth under the auspices of the Montgomery Endowment, which was established in 1977 through the generosity of Kenneth and Harle Montgomery. And during the past 30 years, the endowment has been host to over 170 distinguished artists, writers, historians, scientists, educators, politicians, diplomats, and journalists who've come to campus to mentor undergraduate students. Thus, it's a pleasure for me to welcome, as this summer term's Montgomery Fellow, Jules Feiffer, a Pulitzer Prize and Academy Award winner who has been called, and I quote, one of the 20th century's greatest satirical artists, end of quote. In the 3 short weeks that Jules has been on campus, I think that students and faculty have come to appreciate his childlike enthusiasm, his teasing wit, and his awesome energy. Even though an article in the New York Times on the occasion of his 70th birthday made a point of saying, and this was in the headline, and I quote, that he has slowed down to a gallop, end of quote. The American poet and physician William Carlos Williams once wrote, and I quote, that it is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there, end of quote. I would suggest, however, that it is not poetry alone that sustains human beings as they confront personal and social and political conflicts in their everyday lives, as Williams contends, but cartoons as well. Now, you may find that this is an overstatement, considering the elevated view of poetry we normally have, but this is not the case at all if you look at the thousands of cartoons that Jules Feiffer has drawn in a powerfully concise and minimalist style, not unlike that of poetry, over the past 60 years. The very truth of these cartoons, their fierce honesty and steely satire, their unblinking criticism of the status quo, and their candid assessment of an entire culture's unexamined, self-deluding, often wayward actions in all areas of human activity, is a truth that American women and men needed to be reminded of week after week during the 40 years that Mr. Feiffer created his Village Voice cartoons and in his 19 books and his many plays. Born in the Bronx, Jules Feiffer spent his childhood not playing stoop ball and not playing street stickball, which you would expect of someone born in the Bronx, but reading newspaper comics and listening to radio comedy. At the age of 5, after having won a gold medal in an art contest, he knew that he wanted to become an artist. It would take another 20 years in training at the New York Art Students League and the Pratt Institute before he would get his first job as an apprentice to Will Eisner, creator of The Spirit, a comic strip syndicated in several newspapers. Mr. Feiffer's first cartoon page feature, Clifford, appeared in the early 1950s. During the following years, he created Monroe, his first long satirical work about a 4-year-old boy mistakenly drafted into the U.S. Army, as well as Sick, 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 a guide to non-confident living, his first weekly cartoon series for the Village Voice. Over the next several decades, few were the cultural subjects, the political figures, the myths and ideologies of post-war America that Jules Feiffer's sharp-pointed pen did not skewer or dissect with irony, humor, and well-deserved mockery. Politics, culture, race relations, the misunderstandings between women and men, the wonder and insecurity of childhood, the domineering power of parents and institutions, the threat of the bomb, the manipulation of doctrine and dogma, the Vietnam War, and the misuse and failure of language. From the Cold War to the beginning of the 3rd millennium, Jules Feiffer has, in cautionary cartoons, as he calls them, revealed the prejudices and self-delusions of the leisure society, the advertising society, the great society, the apathetic society, the nuclear society, and the narcissistic society, all of which are American society. Through his favorite cartoon personalities, the sensitive, shy, insecure, neurotic Bernard with his stomach aches, the self-confident, arrogant, crass, testosterone-driven Huey, the lithe, willowy, black leotarded modern dancer, and then in his many plays, written for theater and film, and here are some of the names that you will recognize for sure: Little Murders, Grown Ups, Feiffer's People, Carnal Knowledge, Popeye, A Bad Friend. In all these works, he has unflaggingly brought to light the failings of human beings struggling to give their lives a measure of consistency in a difficult, overbearing world. Now, this is cartooning at its best, a graphic humor that has the poignant intensity of poetry and the tenacity and courage of existential philosophy. It's an art of correction, an art of moral consciousness that attempts to make us more aware of our ills and miseries so that we will work for change. Jules Feiffer's satire is never nihilistic. His humor is never black, because he is an artist of great optimism, even when, at wit's end, he might be tempted to turn his back once and for all on humankind. Now, since the 1990s, Mr. Feiffer has focused his attention on the innocent aspirations and the boundless hopefulness of children. In wondrously humorous and compassionate stories, one about a boy cartoonist who learns that failure is no sin, no sign of weakness. That's the delightful book called The Man in the Ceiling. Another about a dog that can't find his right voice and perhaps doesn't want and doesn't need to. You all know that book. It's called Bark, George. Jules Feiffer expresses his own delight and fun at being a cartoonist and even at being a child, again. This is what he has wrote recently. In the long and short run, I may not affect much but the state of my own sanity. The cartoon keeps it in bounds. It continues the illusion of hope. It erases from me the distant possibility of actual solutions to some of our problems. That possibility is my muse and my rationale. It gets me out of bed in the morning. It humanizes me. It galvanizes me into combat. See me pick up my pen. See me attack my enemies. Ah, cartoon of a happy man. End of quote. And so I ask you to join with me this afternoon in welcoming to Dartmouth this very happy man, Jules Feiffer.
Well, thank you very much. That was my speech. Thank you, and thank you for coming, and good night. I didn't know what to expect when I came here, except a huge house on a pond, there's a thought balloon in my head from the time that Richard called me and invited me in the heart of winter. And if winter has a heart, but in any case, not in New York, let me tell you. And I knew exactly from the time we had our first conversation, what it was that I wanted to do here. You know, he offered me any possibilities, talk about children's books or theater, but for years, just because of my background, my passions, my love for the form, I've wanted to do something, and I didn't know exactly what the form would be, on graphic humor in the 20th century. The comic strip got its start in the 1890s and came to being in the 20th century. I was born in 1929 when the comic strip was little over 30 years old. And it was still an emerging form. And over the previous 10, 15 years and the next 20 years, it would come into its own in all of its brilliance, and then, as these forms do, they would disappear as it has today, virtually without a trace, with the current generation having hardly any memory at all of the newspaper comic strip, which is what I'm talking about. I was never hypnotized and fascinated in the same way with the gag panel, the New Yorker cartoon, that kind of cartoon, which I liked, which I appreciated. And in the early years, in the 40s and 50s, when I read the New Yorker cartoonists, I, like everyone else, admired their work, but it was never anything that I saw myself doing. Well, somehow or other, the newspaper strip got me going. And I discovered over the years, when I built up a library of this work, because some of it started to be reproduced again, that just going to that library occasionally in the middle of whatever else I was doing, which had nothing to do with this, and taking out a book and looking at it, I'd get this excitement and this thrill. And whatever that meant to me, I don't know. One can speculate. Because being a kid in the Bronx who, during the Depression, who couldn't play ball, couldn't throw, couldn't catch, I was a triple non-threat, and of these forms, but I could draw. and I drew on the sidewalks. So they didn't beat me up. It was my passage into the politics of young manhood, learning that cartooning can save your ass. I mean, if you can draw Popeye and they can't, they'll let you live. And so what I'd like to do here is show you a kind of slide survey of that time when I was a kid, the work I loved as a kid, and how it evolved into what I did years later and what I'm doing now. And it has been generally a joyride, and I'm very happy to do it, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'd like to thank everyone responsible for getting me here. It's just a wonderful time, particularly Richard Sterling, my assistant, Catherine Roy. I never had an assistant. To say my assistant. I've been a lonely cartoonist, so even as a playwright, I've worked on my own. I've had such support system here that I don't think I can ever go. I've been corrupted, and I'm not sure I can ever go back to the life I had. You may have trouble getting rid of me. In any case, we will now begin. Can we have the lights lowered, please? Of course, when you talk about comic strips, you go back to the greatest of all. What's depressing a little is that Winsor McCay, whose Little Nemo in Slumberland this is, was by 1904, 1905, the best cartoonist in the world. And in 2009, he remains the best cartoonist in the world. There was never anybody better. There was never anybody who drew better, more imaginative, used form better. And this rather famous cartoon of his at the time and in subsequent years, certainly among cartoonists and other artists, has been stolen or borrowed over the years by children's book authors, by people as diverse as William Joyce, who did Santa Claus, by Maria Sendak. So it's kind of wonderful to see this work live on and on and on in influencing generation upon generation of artists who are illustrators and cartoonists and whoever. And now, when I began, and this is one of my boyhood drawings, my mother saved everything. And I did this at about 7 years old. I love Popeye, but I love comic. I was by the time I was 6, I think, I was a scholar of the comic strip, of the newspaper comic strip. These were the newspaper strips, and this is the Daily Popeye. The newspaper strips were published, most newspapers were broadsheets. There were very few tabloids. There was in New York the Daily News and the New York Daily Mirror. But everything else was huge, and they had comic strips that ran 5, 6 columns across the page, not postage stamp size. They were wonderfully drawn. The daily strips, they might be 12, 15 on one page, and if you're a kid, they just devoured you. I mean, this was during the height of the Depression, the 1930s. Movies were still in black and white. There were very few color movies. There was no such thing as television. Of course, there was no electronic gadgetry of any kind. So this was a form that not just took over children, it took over adults as well. It was, you heard radio comics talking about Dick Tracy and making jokes about Lil Abner, and it was part of the culture, enormous part, which is, it's almost unimaginable to know how integral a part it was of the culture in those years. But I didn't care about that. I cared about the glory of the drawing, the glory of the action, the glory of the storytelling to the extent I could get it at that age. And I studied this stuff. I tried to figure out how it worked, how to tell a story, and who were the cartoonists who best told stories. This was Milton Kenneth, who did Terry and the Pirates. The adventure strip was, by the time I got to it, not even 10 years old. And its greatest innovator was this man, Milton Kenneth, who found a way through shadows and light and dark of putting movies on paper. What you have is the equivalent of what we now see called movie storyboards. Kenneth was the first one who used movie setup shots, silhouettes, long shots, medium shots, so that you follow from panel to panel, and you can almost get a sense of the story, a sense of the action as camera moves without the dialogue. But the dialogue was very important. The characters were very important. To a kid learning his craft from these guys, it was interesting how I learned virtually from the beginning how words and pictures were not separate. Words and pictures were the same thing. That the art of the comic strip, or the good comic strip, was where you couldn't separate one from the other, where the storytelling had to do with the combination of the two. One couldn't exist without the other, and the form as it developed was best developed when the reader was not conscious of whether he was looking at the picture or whether he or she was reading the dialogue. It was all the same thing, and then the creation of character. You know, in just 4 panels a day and 12 panels on Sunday in color, these cartoonists of the daily strips found ways of getting depth, nuance, and individuality into their characters. And no one was better at it than Kenneth, and only one man was his equal. And this is not he. I'll get to him in a minute. But this was the other important strip at the time in terms of fantasy. This is Alex Raymond, who did Flash Gordon. And Flash Gordon, even more than Terry and the Pirates, set a style of drawing, of illustration. It looked like a magazine illustration in the Sunday comics. And Flash Gordon was a hero of the future who's on the planet Mongo, and has his various adventures. And it was an enormous influence on George Lucas, and Star Wars could never have been made without the influence of Flash Gordon. But in addition, Alex Raymond set a style which other cartoonists copied, including this boy cartoonist. This is one of my early, I must have done this at 10 or 11. I was trying to look like Alex Raymond. I was trying to look like anyone but me, which is one of those phases your kids go through, where you think you're really good if you don't look like yourself. And so I was doing what so many comic book artists were doing at the time. I was stealing. So if you take a look at the second panel, and you take a look at this third panel here, there is Flash Gordon being hit. There is my hero, whoever he was, being shot. They seem to have the same expression. They seem to have the same reaction. I kind of prefer mine, but that's how you learn. You learn by stealing, you learn by swiping, and God willing, you will eventually emerge into your own style, which won't look like that. But some never do, and some go on stealing all of their careers, and they never emerge into it. And this was also, another one who stole from Alex Raymond was Joe Shuster, who did Superman. This is from the very first Superman. And it had a primitive look and a gutsy look and an impressionistic look that a kid like me, who could draw but only draw crudely, was very excited by, because when you go to Alex Raymond back here, never in a million years was I ever going to be able to draw that well. I knew that at 19 I was going to draw that well, or 29, or 39, or 59. I was never going to be able to get that look. But on the other hand, I could get that look. And so if you were a young cartoonist and you really wanted to find somebody to ape, these were the guys in comic books who didn't draw much better than I did, and who weren't much older than I, just 3 or 4 years older. And so comic books, when they came in, were a great craze, and particularly for young cartoonists. And Superman, of course, we all know, struck gold. And I wrote on several occasions about my theory about the origins of Superman. Jerry Siegel, who created Superman, was a Jewish boy from Cleveland, on the outskirts of Cleveland, living in the Middle West during the early days of the Anschluss, the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe, an increasing anti-Semitism in the United States, particularly in the Midwest. There was Father Coughlin, the priest on the radio, denouncing Jews, and it was rather respectable at the time. And if you're a young Jewish boy in Cleveland, surrounded by a sense that you're not going to get anywhere, and wanting to be an American more than anything else, and seeing these Gentile jocks and admiring them as they appear in movies on the screen and in pulp magazines, there's that sense that you want to be, you know, nobody knows your true identity. You are really one of them. And so Superman was really an assimilationist dream, that he wasn't this pimply, bespectacled high school Jewish boy, skinny, looking like Clark Kent. If the girls knew, if all those Lois Lanes in the corridor, walking around with those jocks that you just knew who Jerry Siegel really was, they would know that he was this guy. So the real origin, is that Superman didn't come from the planet Krypton, he came from the planet Minsk. Well, or Lodz, or, you know. And the cartoonist I most admired after Milton Caniff, or even with Milton Caniff, was a comic book artist called Will Eisner, also from the Bronx, also a Jewish boy, coming out of the ghetto, and a few years older, about 4 or 5 years, no, about 7 years older than I, and who in the 1940s created this comic book supplement called The Spirit in the Sunday newspapers. And it was easily as innovative as Terry and the Pirates, easily as inventive, and far more satiric, and I just fell madly in love with it. And as you can see here, the layouts are also like storyboards. They're movie layouts, but they have style and they have charm and and density. And Eisner was a dream to me. And I went down to his office one day with my samples when I was almost 17 years old. I looked him up in the phone book. I don't know where I got the nerve, but I walked in. He was sitting at his desk. He actually welcomed me. He asked me to sit down. He looked at my work. He looked at it for about 30 seconds and told me it was awful. And I sat there listening to how awful it was and what was wrong with it. And I reacted as I always react when I get bad news, which is I don't hear it. And I changed the subject. And I was not going to walk out of there being told that I was terrible. So I started talking about him. I started talking about his work. I started talking about the work he did early in his career. I knew all of it. I had a whole dossier on it. He had 3 very capable artists and a lettering man working in the inner office who were helping him out with his stuff, who were his assistants. But they didn't give a damn about Eisner's work. They thought he was kind of passé, and they didn't talk about him. He was not a hero to them. He was just their employer. When Eisner heard me talk about his career, when Eisner discovered that I knew everything he had ever done and talked about it as if it were an art, what could he do? He hired me as a groupie. He had no choice. And I was in the office from that Monday on, day after day, being given assignments, screwing them up, being given more assignments, screwing them up. But you know, those early months, I wasn't being paid anything, and that was more than I was worth. And if you take a look at here, you see these blacks here. He would do these open shaded areas, and they put an X there where black goes, and I'd fill in the blacks, and I'd screw it up. I'd be asked to do these borders. I'd screw it up. And it took a long time for me not to screw it up too badly, but this was a form that I had given my life over to being part of. And it turned out that I seemed unqualified. And so as time went on, and Eisner could not afford to get rid of me because by the time he was paying me, it was so little that he had to keep me around. He tried me on stories. And it turned out that I could write The Spirit. And I could write it better than he could in those years. And so I became the writer, and I actually got some authority in the office. And through all of this, even during the time that I was screwing everything up, I was having a wonderful time because I was with my hero. I was meeting other cartoonists. Up and coming young cartoonists would come in and out of that office, and they'd sit around and talk and shop there, and it was just a kind of marvelous life. And here is a story, one of the spirit stories that I wrote, in which I, as Eisner's assistant, that's me as a young man. I once had that hair, but I never, I was a lot better looking than that, I assure you. And I'm sitting at Eisner's desk. I come into Eisner's asleep at his desk. I shoot him dead, and I take over the spirit. No more, I was doing a little kid strip at the time called Clifford. He had given me, I'd asked him for a raise. He said I wasn't worth it. But he said, if you want the back page, I'll give you the back page to do what you want. So the spirit was an 8-page comic book insert. And it was 7 pages of the spirit, and the 8th page was what they call a filler of another comic strip. He got rid of that. I created this little boy called Clifford. And this is an example. This was an early Clifford. And my first printed work. Kid's walking down the street. He says, being a little boy can be a pain in the neck sometime. For instance, you just get one view of people. All the time, just one view. How would you like it? And a dog comes along. He says, Earth. He says, you and me, doggy, nobody knows we're alive. Dog goes, sigh. Walking along, walked on, stepped all over. Nothing, that's us. Sigh goes the dog. They don't notice another little dog, even smaller than either one of them, walking, ignored, looking around, a tear in his eye, and then walking off sadly, saying, being a little dog can be a pain in the neck sometimes. Now, this was in January 22nd, 1950, it says here, some 6 years before I started in the Village Voice. And this was the first hint of what I would soon be doing. And when I got in the Voice, this was the second strip, redrawn for the book 666. Kid throws a ball into the air. It drops. He can't catch it. It falls between his hands. He says, okay, I can practice. I can learn all the angles. Maybe I'll take a few evening courses. I've got a whole lifetime ahead of me to learn to catch a ball. He throws it up again. It drops between his hands. 11 years, he says, and he walks off saying, shot to hell. and that was, an early version of the self-pity that was later to make me famous. A later version. I can't go to Jimmy's house because it's Jimmy's turn to come to my house. Because I went to Jimmy's house last time. But I like to go to Jimmy's house. And Jimmy doesn't like to come to my house. But if he won't come to my house, I can't go to his house. Because fair's fair. So I won't ever see Jimmy again. Boy, is 7 hard. So years before I even thought of doing kids' books, I was drawing kids in my strip. Not often, but half a dozen, 8 or 10 times a year. Because, and this is also before I was a father, and because I was the kid. And also because when you draw adults, let's see what this next one is. You draw adults, adults have learned to hide their body language. When you draw adults in dialogue with each other, they're like this, or like this, or like, but they're not going to betray how they feel. They're not going to betray their emotions. But this kid, you could read him. And as with all children, you can generally read their moods, what they're thinking, how they behave, through their body language. And as a cartoonist, I love to do revelation through the line, physically drawing the kid, and except that drawing the politicians I later was drawing, and drawing the adults who were hiding things that I was later drawing, they didn't show up. They didn't show their feelings. So it was wonderful to do dances, and it was wonderful to do kids because it gave me a chance to do the kind of line work I was not allowed to do because of the nature of the work, the demands of the cartoon. A mother and son in outline. What are you hiding from me? She says. Nothing. Something is bothering you. Is it that your father and I fight? I don't care. Fighting is sometimes good. When we don't fight, we hide things, like you're hiding things from me right now. No, I'm not. But when you fight, you're too mad to hide things and you give away what's bothering you. What's good about that? Well, then it's easier afterwards to be closer to each other. If you're so close, why fight? But if we didn't fight, we wouldn't find out what the other person is thinking. Why do you have to know what everyone's thinking? So we can understand each other's point of view and like each other better. If you like each other better so much, why do you fight? Because your father is seeing another woman. Now see what your hiding has done? Two teenagers. She says, I will never forget the last 5 days with you, Joey. You're compassionate, you're sensitive, you're sincere, you're thoughtful, you're caring. I needed the break, thanks. Now I'm going back to men. Now you see in this and in the previous cartoon that unlike the cartoonists who are my heroes who use different angles and different moods and different camera shots, basically I had a fixed camera and it was either full face or profile because the main thing was to move the dialogue forward. And I found that if I played with different points of view, it would distract from the text. And the pictures and the text had to just move forward, barrel on to the end because I was often saying things that made demands on the reader, and I wanted to make as few visual demands as I could to get to the point and make it easier for them and for me in my storytelling. At 16, I was stupid, confused, insecure, and indecisive. At 25, I was wise, self-confident, prepossessing, and assertive. At 45, I am stupid, confused, insecure, and indecisive. Who would have guessed that maturity is only a short break in adolescence? In college, I always expected one day to get down to reading Kafka, Joyce, Proust, and Henry James, and now that I'm 50, and I haven't, frankly, I'm ashamed. So I asked my kids who are now in college if they are reading Kafka, Joyce, Proust, and Henry James, and they answered, who? There's a lot wrong with my generation, but at least we were educated to know what to be ashamed of. You're born and you know you're the center of the universe. And childhood is the process of learning you're not the center of the universe. And adolescence is the process of coming to terms with not being the center of the universe. And maturity is the process of forgetting you ever thought you were the center of the universe. And old age is watching others become the center of the universe and hating them. Teenager. I was flunking out of school, so first I thought of committing suicide. Then I thought of shooting my parents who pushed me too hard. Then I thought of hacking to pieces my kid brother who does everything better than me. Then I thought of torching the school because it's the cause of all my problems. Finally, I firebombed the TV, which was really stupid. Now where am I going to get my ideas? This was my very first political cartoon, and it was in the Village Voice about the 4th or 5th week that I was doing it in late 1956. And it's advertising. As Richard commented, I did a lot on advertising, and this is for politics. The item on the agenda, gentlemen, is the fallout bit. This is when we were doing underground testing of our nuclear bomb, our atom bomb. And there were all sorts of rumors, never in the New York Times or any of the mainstream papers, that there was leakage and radioactive fallout. And the government always denied that there were any harmful effects, as people got cancer and died in the West and elsewhere. So here we go. The item on the agenda, gentlemen, is the fallout bit. Our client isn't happy with our campaign. The public is negative fallout conscious. We must make them positive fallout conscious. I have here the outline of a fallout is good for you saturation campaign. It includes such items as I like fallout buttons, decals inscribed with your government knows best, a TV special called I Fell for Fallout. And as a capper, a Mr. and Mrs. Mutation contest designed to change the concept of beauty in the American mind. And an offstage voice says, but what about the scientists, Chief? And he says, no problem. We'll say they're organized and have them all subpoenaed. It's one of our most successful sales devices. This is Lyndon Johnson. When in his first year, when he got the Voting Rights Act published, and before he ran for election in his own right and went from being a great president to a war criminal. As your present president, it is incumbent upon me to play a variety of roles in the course of a single day. Policeman to the world, social worker to the poor, lover of peace, seeker of consensus, educator, civil rights leader. At the close of the day, what a relief it is to be able to get in my pajamas and just be myself. This is Johnson in his later phase with the credibility gap. We didn't have a credibility gap between government and the people. I mean, even though government always lied, nobody did it on as grand a scale and as alarmingly and it's extraordinary on such an extraordinary level as Lyndon Johnson, and it began to affect him. He couldn't find anybody who believed him. He said, "Will you believe me?" "No." "Will you believe me?" He asked this black man. "No." "You believe me, boy?" "No." "Honey, will you believe me?" "No," she says. "Is there no one left who believes me?" Kid says, "I believe you." He reads from a press release. "In the interest of freedom and in the purpose of peace, we have today bombed." There was a Washington Press media story circulating in Johnson's day, which was, how do you know when the president is lying? And the story went, when he rubs his nose, he's telling the truth. When he sits back in his chair, he's telling the truth. When he scratches his head, he's telling the truth. When he loosens his tie, he's telling the truth. When he opens his mouth, he's lying. I used to think, another thing that's always interested me is the use or misuse of language as we pretend to communicate. I used to think I was poor. Then they told me I wasn't poor, I was needy. Then they told me it was self-defeating to think of myself as needy. I was deprived. Then they told me deprived was a bad image. I was underprivileged. Then they told me underprivileged was overused. I was disadvantaged. I still don't have a dime, but I have a great vocabulary. In 1968, Eugene McCarthy was running for president against the war in Vietnam, and there were a lot of rumors about Bobby Kennedy entering the race. And I did this cartoon in a children's book style with kind of crude lettering to look like kids. These are the Bobby twins. One is a good Bobby, one is a bad Bobby. The good Bobby is a courageous reformer. The bad Bobby makes deals. The good Bobby sent federal troops down south to enforce civil rights. The bad Bobby appointed racist judges down south to enforce civil rights. The good Bobby is a fervent civil libertarian. The bad Bobby is a fervent wiretapper. The good Bobby is ill at ease with liberals. The bad Bobby is ill at ease with grown-ups. If you want one Bobby to be your president, you will have to take both, for Bobbies are widely noted for their family unity. And this is a 60s kid. I occupy buildings, raid files, scream obscenities, throw rocks, and call cops pigs in an attempt to humanize this brutalized society. This is Nixon at the time of Watergate, wearing shades and talking to his associates. Lefty, you burgle Ellsberg shrink. Muggsy, you bug the Watergate. Louis, you burn the evidence. No nose, you shred the memos. Butch, you bomb Cambodia. Any questions? What if we get caught? I don't know you, I never heard of you, I don't know nothing. And what I loved most about drawing this outside of Nixon and shades was this old-fashioned hood from old-time comics with a pull-down cap and the checkerboard suit. This is Nixon toward the end. And he's a stonewall. I stonewalled them on the war. I stonewalled them on the cover-up. I stonewalled them on the taxes. I stonewalled them on the tape. As the wall keeps crumbling, I stonewall them on the courts, and there's nothing left. I have not yet begun to stonewall. After Nixon died, two guys talking. Watergate will fade in time and Nixon will be seen as a great president. Why? Asked the second one. Because of his foreign policy achievements, such as the opening of China. What was great about that? Asked the second one. No Democratic president would have had Nixon's courage to go to China. Why not? Asked the second one. He would have been brutally attacked for being soft on communism. By whom? Nixon. And this is who lost Vietnam? Not I, said Ike, I just sent money. Not I, said Jack, I just sent advisors. Not I, said Lyndon, I just followed Jack. Not I, said Dick, I just honored Jack and Lyndon's commitments. Not I, said Jerry. What was the question? You lost Vietnam, said Henry, because you didn't trust your leaders. One of my favorite non-presidential characters and caricatures was our former Secretary of State and still aspiring Secretary of everything. And this is when Nelson Rockefeller, for that brief period of time, was vice president under Jerry Ford. And Kissinger is at a dinner. Now, Kissinger's career was dependent on Nelson Rockefeller, who gave him his first break and, and brought him into politics in the first place. And he's saying, I can't believe it. Here I am, a mere Secretary of State, having dinner with Nelson Rockefeller. I will observe which fork he picks up. I will pick up the same fork. By this tactic, I will avoid a faux pas. He is eating with his fingers. What shall I do? He can eat with his fingers because he is Nelson Rockefeller. But I am a mere Secretary of State. He is wiping his fingers on the president's shirt. That may be etiquette for Nelson Rockefeller, but a disgrace for a mere Secretary of State. I am sick to the heart. How can I look the Secretary of State in the mirror again when I do not have the clout to wipe my fingers on the president's shirt? I will go to my, he will leave this consulate. I will go to my office, bug some phones, and overthrow a small Latin American country. Powerless I may be, but I am proud. A black kid, he says, recession is when middle-class whites are unemployed. Depression is when more middle-class whites are unemployed. Normalcy is when I'm unemployed. Jimmy Carter, as a boy, little boy in Plains, Georgia, sitting by a creek, he said, fish, I am hungry. My family is hungry. There are few of us and many of you. I call upon you to do the adequate, competent, and decent thing for the common good. Farmer comes and says, what are you doing, little Jimmy? Jimmy says, fishing. Farmer says, but you didn't bring a pole. Jimmy says, but I have faith. The fish will do what is right. A woman watching TV, she says, Ronald Reagan talks to me on television. No nonsense, no gobbledygook, no showboating, no ego games, just simple, sensible, plain-spoken, and sincere. Who cares if he's lying? And now, this was George Bush, the first, who I always drew as a prep school kid, in pants and, a little chickpea cap. And there was an actual incident where he got the date of Pearl Harbor wrong, calling it September 7th rather than December 7th. So I have him here, September 7th, making a speech. Today is a famous anniversary. On this date in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. What? And it's the middle of the presidential campaign against Dukakis. Lee Atwater is Bush's campaign chief. September 8th, press conference. Mr. Atwater, how could Mr. Bush, who boasts of his patriotism, mistake one of the most famous dates in American history? And Atwater in a news conference says, this vice president will not back down to irresponsible media distortions of his statement on the exact date of Pearl Harbor, over which even some experts disagree. September 15th, Bush is talking on TV. The media tries to force me to change, but this veteran knows in his heart what is right, so don't let the liberals confuse you on Pearl Harbor. The guy watching says, just like Harry Truman. September 20th, the polls indicate a swing toward Mr. Bush in his battle with the media over Pearl Harbor. September 25th, Michael Dukakis announced today that it's time to put the Pearl Harbor controversy behind us and has accepted September 7th, 1941 to be accurate. The Democratic Party never changes. I'm for campaign finance reform, and I take money from everyone. I'm for family values, and I haven't seen my children since I last ran for office. I oppose gay rights, but I love young men. So support the hypocrisy ticket, and I pledge to stand tall against all my core beliefs and fight for what you pretend to believe in and don't. Yay! And this is a CBS boardroom back in the old days. We tried Dan Rather in a sweater, but the ratings went down. We tried him in a pinstripe, smoking a pipe, still the ratings dropped. We tried him with short sleeves, hairy forearms, a glass of scotch, lost 3 points. What if Dan isn't the only problem? Maybe the problem's a smug, overwrought, simple-minded way we present the news, total silence. Or we could try him in a dress, which they now have. This is my first Bill Clinton cartoon, and the first cartoon one of the first I had in the New Yorker, The Boyfriend. Bill Clinton reminds me of the kind of, this is 3 months into office. Bill Clinton reminds me of the kind of man I fell for in my 20s. He'd show up late, but with a perfect excuse. He'd stand me up, but look so pained when he explained that I'd forgive him. I'd catch him in a lie he'd deny with such eloquence I'd doubt my own senses. I'd confront him with his deceptions. He'd look at me as if I were crazy and needed help. I wish I'd known when I voted for Bill Clinton that I wasn't getting a president, but another sick relationship. And this is after the trial. I lied to the country. I lied to my wife. I lied to my staff. I regret it. I take full and complete responsibility. Let's go to the vineyard. A man lamenting communism collapsed back in '89, followed by the collapse of the left, followed by the collapse of liberalism, followed by disdain for the idea that government exists to help people. So now we debate Ken Starr and the president's sex life. Once there's a consensus that we can't fix anything, what's left but gossip? Do you swear to tell the quarter truth, the sort of truth, the shaded truth, the fudge truth, the truth that makes you look good and your critics look like low-life hectoring hound dogs to help you God? Hey, no problem. And this is when it was rumored that Colin Powell was going to run. I'm for Colin Powell because he's not a politician, he's not a Democrat, he's not a right-wing Republican, he's not Bill Clinton, and he's not one of those blacks who thinks government owes him something. But wait, he is black. I'm for Colin Powell until he runs. And this was what, in 1995. And then a couple of years later, there were rumors that Barack Obama was going to run for president, and it was after everybody had ceded the Democratic nomination to Hillary Clinton. The primaries hadn't even started to happen yet. And I did this cartoon for the New York Times op-ed page to the tune of Maria from West Side Story. Obama, we've just met a man named Obama, delectable, selectable, maybe even electable. Obama, Obama, we need you to run, dear Obama. Cuter than Gore, you're anti-war, who could ask for more? We could learn to adore you, Obama. Obama, 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 a thriller he, killer he, best of all, he's not Hillary. Obama, Obama, Obama. Now, sometime later, Obama became a candidate for president, actually won the Democratic nomination. And I did this one, same people, new drawing. Obama, since you made the run, our lives are more fun, but there's not so much to be done with Obama. You'll bring about change, you'll narrow their range and rearrange Obama. Who clarifies, who unifies, who throws higher fives than Obama? Whatever works to elect you doesn't have to affect you. When you're president, go be Lincoln. But to get there, start rethinking. We'll understand if you sin, sell out to get in. Obama, we're counting on you. You're what we are due to make our dreams come true. If you lose, what will we do? You must be our Obama. And that was my last political cartoon. I had by that time stopped drawing for the Village Voice for some years. I stopped syndication. And only when I got an idea, and I wasn't getting that many anymore because I was not that interested anymore in covering politics. I'd been done it for almost 50 years. But I couldn't resist the Obama campaign, and I did that. Now, after all this work, after all these years, you'd think there'd be some confusion and indecision in my life, and I needed therapy, and I did. And here is Dr. Freud, who represented me, listening to his answering machine. This is Dr. Freud. I am in consultation. After the turn, please leave your message. No, please your name and a brief message. Thanks. Beep. Freud, this is Tolstoy. I can't make today's session. My life is out of control. My wife is out of control. Beep. This is Lenin. Your bill has arrived. I think you're a capitalist stooge and lackey. I really hate your machine, or is this more resistance on my part? Beep. Dr. Freud, this is Margaret Sanger. I dreamed I had your baby. I'm worried. Please call. Beep. This is Franklin Roosevelt. In our last session, you said I had nothing to fear but fear itself. What did you mean exactly? I am terribly confused. Beep. This is Gandhi. I know you're listening. It troubles me that I manipulate others in order to have my own way. I won't eat again until I hear from you. Now, besides the cartoons, while I was doing the cartoons, there was other stuff happening in the world, and stuff that I felt that could be handled in cartoons. After the assassination of Kennedy, and Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Ruby, and the events that followed, I began to sense that this was a country that seemed to be headed into a national nervous breakdown, with, in the next couple of years, all forms of authority that had been going on through generations had begun to lose their legitimacy and were collapsing under their, of their own weight. And I waited for somebody to read about that or somebody to talk about it, and it didn't seem to be happening, and so I tried it as a book, and that didn't work. And so I wrote this play, Little Murders, which was just about that, and that was my first play. And I discovered, to my amazement, that I loved it. I loved the form, that I could write a play, whatever the critics had to say. And they hated the original version of the Broadway production of Little Murders, but it came back 2 years later off Broadway. A lot more had happened, which allowed the critics to understand what I was talking about, and it was a hit, and I was launched as a playwright. And a few years later, wrote a play called Carnal Knowledge, which Mike Nichols said he'd like to do as a movie instead, and this is what we did. And this is a shot of Nicholson and Margaret in this production that Mike did, which was one of the great working experiences of my life. I had always worked, as I said, as a cartoonist in solitude. So working in theater and then working in film was the first time I experienced collaboration. I acted in collaboration. I discovered that rather than having a hard time adjusting to it, I had a ball because people were around me and you could talk and you could learn, and just having actors, live actors, do your lines and do them as if they were making them up, and representing what you had to write on a piece of paper in so many better ways than you ever imagined it, because all writers have the perfect script in their head, as it's spoken. You can't imagine being done any other way, and any good actor will do it a completely different way, and it's always better. And it was wonderful to find that out. This is Bob Dishy, a wonderful actor in my family play called Grown Ups. And this is Paul Dooley, a wonderful actor from Second City and improvisational actor, in the role of Wimpy in Popeye. Robert Evans called me up one day, the producer, and asked me if I would write the screenplay for the movie Popeye. And since I had loved Popeye since I was a kid, I happily complied. And it was odd that my first work for children, official work for kids, was in the movie version of Popeye. And so Popeye was my first kid's work, and then I started to get into children's books and wrote Bark George, and A Room with a Zoo, which is about my daughter Julie and my refusal to buy her a dog. Julie is now 5 years older, and we've had the dog for 5 years. And the first book I wrote, which Richard mentioned, the man in the ceiling, about a boy cartoonist. Writing these books and illustrating these books, and I've now, I don't have any samples of them, but I've now begun illustrating other books by other writers, and I've done 2 by my daughter Kate, Henry the Dog with No Tail, and a recent book called Which Puppy, about the Obamas getting a dog. It's been the great joy of my later life because I found that it takes me back to the stuff I was doing as a kid. Here in The Man in the Ceiling, I'm drawing the way I did as a kid, or trying to show this young cartoonist, Jimmy Gibbet, and how he drew. And so it takes me full circle. There I was at 5 and 6 and 7 on all fours, reading these comic strips, adoring them, imagining myself in the future doing some kind of work like that. And here I am from my 70s on, now some years later, doing work which is like the work I began doing when Popeye was being hit by a boxer and he hit the guy. I mean, it's a wonderful full circle, and it's made me very, very happy. But now I can't ignore, but that a model over all of these years for me in doing my work in one form or another has always been Fred Astaire, because he made a career out of taking what was very hard work and made it look effortless, made it look as if it wasn't anything. And that's always been in my writing and my drawing, something that I've worked to do. Here, my character Bernard is saying, the one thing I should have been, I'm not, Fred Astaire. But I don't have the talent or discipline to be Fred Astaire. So I do the next best thing. I tap dance my way through life. I tap dance my way through relationships, around my family, in and out of personal crises. At times I wish I could slow down long enough for some Ginger Rogers to catch me. But when one of them comes too close, I tap dance away. Sensational, but isolated, I dance on. The curse of Fred Astaire. Now, I always like to conclude these shows with my own dance. So, Professor, can we have the music, please? Thank you.
Questions, right?
Yeah. Now, for those of you,
I'll make an announcement first. Jules will take questions in a minute, but I just wanted to make 2 quick announcements. The first is that his books will be for sale outside, and Jules will be happy to sign them, so that's right after he finishes answering your questions. But the second thing I wanted to mention is that on August 12th at 4 o'clock in this room, we're going to have 3 other cartoonists who will participate in a panel with Jules on the art and politics of cartooning. Jules Feiffer, Jeff Danziger, Ed Sorrell, Ed Corin, all of whom are friends.
Whoever they are.
That's right, what do they know? When I asked Jules what a group of cartoonists should be called, a herd, a pride, a gaggle, he said they're called a giggle. What questions do we have here?
You have a question, you're walking out on us. All right. I want your name.
Jules, thank you. That was really fabulous. Maybe you don't want to think about this, but the question I have is, if you had to write a cartoon that somehow summarized the career of George II, what would you say?
Now, you're dealing with a deaf man here, so can you rephrase that so I understand?
The question is, if you had to deal with George II
Yeah.
as a subject
But
for
I
your cartoons.
didn't have to. That's the beauty part of quitting. You know, I left the field at a time when I thought all possibility of change was gone. You know, that I was thoroughly disillusioned after Bush v. Gore with where this country was and where it was going, and the country that my children and grandchildren were going to inherit was not the country, with all of its problems, that I had vested my hopes and dreams and illusions in, and I thought that was all nonsense. That illusion was shattered. It was not going to reemerge. And I was doing this work not to beat up on people, but as a means of inquiry, self-inquiry, and hoping to contribute to a sensibility that would bring in some change to the country. And I didn't believe that anymore. I had soured completely. So I saw no point in going in showing this souring, to this increased cynicism and bitterness in a weekly cartoon. I didn't think that would serve anybody, and it certainly wouldn't serve me or my family. And fortunately, with the election of the amazing election of Obama, that bitterness and anger ended, and I've got the second president in my lifetime that I've actually been for since Franklin D. Roosevelt. It's been a while, and we'll see how he does. But I no longer feel that anger, that bitterness, and I feel hope for my kids and grandchildren. But I don't want to go back to that game. I'm having much too much fun doing this. Another question. All my answers are going to be that long, so you.
How did you make the transition from Clifford and working for Eisner to Sick, 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 which is so different?
Well, when I was with Eisner, I really thought of myself as a comic strip artist. And I was going to work in that form. And my heroes increasingly were people like Walt Kelly, who did the brilliant Pogo. And I still liked Al Cap, who did Little Abner. It was before Cap moved far to the right. This is back in the late 40s and early 50s. But when I was drafted, I was in the Army. It was 1951, the tail end of the Korean War. I was in for 2 years. In those 2 years, nothing bad happened to me. Nobody sent me out to shoot anybody, or nobody tried to shoot me. But I found the mindless authority that kept the Army running, and the day-to-day automatic abuse that one took as a conscript in the military so enraged me. And the lies you were told about the Cold War and what was going on politically so enraged me that I was angry all of the time. And because I was a cartoonist, the anger took its form out in my work. And I started fiddling with cartoons that were going to express that. And I did single panel ones, and that didn't work out, something I called Army Types. And then I got an idea about an adult book that looked like a children's book about a little boy who got drafted by, a 4-year-old kid who gets drafted into the Army by mistake. And he tries to tell the people in charge he's only 4. And they don't believe him because they don't draft men of 4, as they explain. And he ends up believing them because they are figures of authority, and why would they lie? So it's this turning reality on its head and the acceptance of this reality that we've turned on our head that seemed to me what I saw every day in the Army. It seemed to me it's what I saw regularly in the acting out of our foreign policy. And it seemed to me it's what I saw in government press releases that meant one thing but said something else. So I decided, or it decided for me, the Cold War decided what would be my career, because I evolved into this Cold War cartoonist. And drawing like Will Eisner or drawing like Walt Kelly didn't seem to be the proper style for someone who was set to overthrow the government. So I had to find a style, and I started looking to others. And I found the work of William Steig, who was doing this remarkable work in his books, not yet acceptable in the New Yorker, where he was a regular cartoonist for his more conventional work. But Steig was doing drawings from the inside out, using the inner consciousness of his characters to express on paper what they were really thinking. So they'd be scribbles, they'd be abstractions, they'd be Picasso-like. It was remarkable stuff. And with wonderful little captions, "Mother loved me, but she died." Then another mother with a mouth open and a scream saying, "Willie," and inside her mouth is this tiny little boy looking terrified. So they're just abstract notions that gave you the outside and the inside at the same time, and I was thrilled by that. And then the emerging stylization of Saul Steinberg, who was finding his own way then, and that was very, and a Belgian-French cartoonist named André Francois. So all of these people began, George Gross and his Weimar cartoons and illustrations. All of these people seemed to express much better than the comic strip artists who I had grown up emulating. These guys seemed to express in a style that I needed to adapt for myself the direction that I must go in. And so I started moving that way. If one looks, I've got a book out called Explainers, which is the first 10 years of Village Voice cartoons, chronologically arranged. And if you look at that, you will see from week to week my struggling to find a style, my struggling to find an approach that that works best with the text that I've already arrived at in terms of where I want to go, but I didn't know how I wanted to draw, and it took something like 6 or 8 months to figure it out in front of the reader, but I did. And it still keeps changing, and I still keep learning, and that's part of the process and part of the fun. I told you there'd be long answers. Yes?
You went to see Will Eisner, and he told you how bad your stuff is. And that seems to be a recurring theme when you go towards what you want to do and be near the people you want to be near. You can't do what they do.
Say it again with me on top of you.
I
All right,
know
don't.
somebody who had a professor with a stamp that
Yeah.
said crap, 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 and
Yeah.
he'd go down and do that to the papers. When you went to see Eisner to learn and to work with him, how did that negative energy help you find
That's a
the
wonderful
positive
question.
energy to be the underground, to be the leader in the field?
I've just written a memoir, which it comes out next March, and the dedication is to my children and grandchild and future grandchildren. And I say to them, remember, do not let your judges define you. And somehow I've known that all my life, and somehow I've had the stubbornness to act on it. From early childhood, in one way or another, I experienced rejection. And if that rejection were taken to heart, I mean, of course, it hurt and wounded and enraged me and did all those things that rejection does. But I was not going to believe what they were saying. Because if I believed what they were saying, it would turn me into someone else. It would turn me into someone who checked everyone else's opinion before he made a step, who needed the approval and okay of everyone. And for a period of time, I was like that and had lots of ambivalence about everything and couldn't make decisions and I worked my way out of that because I knew that in this way, you die. So I stopped. It's not that I didn't listen to criticism, and it wasn't that I didn't gain from some criticism, but I learned to discern between the people who meant well and the people who were schmucks. And there are a lot of schmucks out there. And if you take them seriously, I mean, my God, theater critics, dear God. And I know that if there were, back when I started, if there were comic strip critics who had influence, that I wouldn't have had a career, because they would have dismissed me and I would have been dismissed. So you can't let, if you believe strongly in what you're doing, the others tell you who and what you are, or there's no life for you then. Yeah.
How do you feel about political correctness? Are there any lines you will not cross?
How do I feel about political correctness? I think that, it's not anything I've given much thought to. I think the whole discussion of it is rather silly. There are people who bend over backwards not to offend, and I take pleasure in offending those people. The term political correctness means that in one's work, you watch what you say, and you edit yourself so as not to offend this one, or bother this one, or perhaps cross a line here. And it's another term for it is self-censorship. And it seemed to me in the 50s, when I began my work, that it was the post-Joe McCarthy years. And a lot of the horrendous political suffocation that had dropped on the society had loosened up. And censorship, which really did exist rather heavily at one point, had lifted, but there was self-censorship. And looking around, I found more writers and artists not doing things that might not meet approval than doing things and not taking chances. And I thought at the time that this was more dangerous than actual censorship, because censorship demands eventual rebellion and struggling against. Self-censorship, you don't even know that you're doing it after a while. It becomes a habit. And just as when you're listening to your judges, you have nowhere to go but down, inward, and to be unproductive and do bad work. So I basically ignore it, either political correctness from either side.
Question on that side.
Yes.
Do you read Doonesbury?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Do you read Doonesbury?
Do I read Doonesbury? I don't look at comic strips much anymore. Gary Trudeau's a friend of mine. I love his work. I think he's been constant over the years. He's been remarkably consistent. But I don't see the New York Daily News in which it appears. And I don't own a computer, so I can't read it online. And so I don't see it. Don't tell him. I deny everything. Like, if Dick Cheney can do that, I can't. Yes, sir.
When you were syndicated and you had a deadline and you had like a writer's block, what did you do?
When I was syndicated and I had a deadline and I had a writer's block, what did I do? I did some of my best work. If what working in the newspaper world does is make deadlines a kind of relationship, a flirtation, and it's remarkable. And you cannot have an idea and be miserable and say, this is it, and it's over. And then that day, an hour before, suddenly it comes, and you start working, and you start doing it, and often it turns out to be the best work you've ever done. Who knows who controls this kind of activity? It ain't up here. It comes from somewhere else. And when it's good, it can be very good, and when it's bad, it can be awful. Anybody from this side of the room? The silent side? The listeners?
Here's my voice. Have you ever had a cartoon killed by an editor for whatever reason in the course? Because I know some cartoonists who have had that problem.
Yeah, I have, and it's always cheered me. I always thought it was a form of quality control, that I knew that I still had my bite if they were killing me. It was acceptance, and too much acceptance that was bothering me in the mid-'60s. That was another reason that drove me into writing plays. I thought, Gide had this line, do not understand me too quickly. And I thought, with all the approval I was getting and all the fans I was getting, that I was being misunderstood. So I wrote a play to straighten it out, and the play closed in a week, and I was understood again.
One more question?
Sir.
You don't have a computer. What do you think will happen to your art form if newspapers stop publishing?
Well, I'm not doing cartoons anymore. I beat them to it. I stopped drawing for them before they stopped publishing me. Now there was one more over there. That'll be the last question.
First, I'd like to say I love the voices you read the strips with.
I'm sorry, what?
I love the voices that you read your strips with.
Me too. You want to hear some more? And I can.
It's okay. You don't have to do any more if you don't want to. I actually had a couple questions, but since we've got time and everything, I'll just ask this one. Since you got the experience of working under Eisner, what was it like working for him? What was he like?
What was working for Eisner like? Eisner, and we're talking about the 1950s now, was this very affable and occasionally tart man who was brilliant and loved to communicate. He enjoyed conversations with young people like me and many others. He enjoyed giving advice, and he wasn't smug about it or snotty about it. He liked to teach, and he was very smart, and he liked to share what he knew. He took me down to a printing plant to show me how comic strips were printed in the printing presses and how mats were made and all of that, and showed me every aspect. I understood nothing. To this day, I understand nothing. But he understood how every part of it worked. And he was generous in many ways, and then when I made it, he got pissed off. But we reclaimed our friendship, and and when he died, he had come to see a play of mine, A Bad Friend it was called, in Washington, D.C. with his wife, and we had dinner afterwards, and it was a lovely time, and 3 weeks later, he was gone. And he was the history of comics would be very different without him. He was an enormous influence and enormously important.
Well, Jules, thank you very much.
Thank you.